The words cut deeper than I ever thought words could, slicing through the quiet of my kitchen like a knife through silk. "Mom, you're too old for this trip. You'd only slow us down." My daughter Claire said it with a half smile, the kind you'd offer a child who's asked for something foolish. She stood there in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd rolled out dough for her birthday cakes, where I'd kissed her forehead after nightmares, where I'd taught her to braid her hair, her arms folded, her eyes darting to her phone. I was 67, not gone from this world. But to Claire, I was already fading a shadow, slipping into the background of her bright, bustling life. My name is Margaret. For 42 years, I've called this house my home. I raised 2 children here, Claire and Michael, their laughter once filling every corner. I buried my husband Tom here too, his memory lingering in the creak of the porch, swing the scent of his pipe tobacco that still clings to his old armchair. I'm not one for theatrics. I've always been the steady hand, the one who packed lunches with little notes, who sewed rips in their jeans, who bit her lip when the world turned unkind. But that day, standing in the heart of my own home, I felt as though I'd been struck. Claire wasn't alone. Her husband Greg leaned against the counter, his lips twitching into a smirk, his eyes flicking to her as if they were sharing a private jest. My son Michael was there too, his gaze fixed on the worn linoleum floor. He didn't speak. He didn't defend me. No one did. The vacation was their grand plan, a week at a resort in the Bahamas, all pristine beaches and turquoise waves, the kind of place I'd only glimpsed in glossy travel magazines. For months, they'd been buzzing about it, their voices spilling over FaceTime calls. I was never part of chattering about infinity pools, gourmet dinners, and spa treatments. I'd caught snippets of it one evening, Claire's excitement crackling through the phone as she spoke to Michael. It's a family trip, she'd set her voice bright with possibility. I'd assumed foolishly perhaps that family included me. I'm their mother, aren't I? The one who paid for Claire's braces, who worked extra shifts to cover her college tuition, who sold my grandmother's pearl necklace to buy Michael his first car. I thought family meant all of us bound by years of love and sacrifice. So I asked, hesitant, almost apologetic, as if I were intruding on their lives. "Claire, could I come along? I'd love to see the ocean with you all." In my mind, I saw it so clearly, my grandchildren, Lily and Max, splashing in the waves, their giggles rising like music, me sipping tea on a balcony, the sea breeze soft against my skin. Maybe even a moment, just one where Claire and I could sit together talking like we used to before life pulled us apart. I hadn't traveled since Tom passed 6 years ago, his illness draining our savings and my spirit. The thought of this trip felt like a spark, a chance to feel alive again, to be part of something joyful. Her laugh came first, sharp and sudden, like glass shattering. "Mom, no. It's not that kind of trip. It's for, fun." Greg's snort followed poorly, disguised as a cough. Michael shifted his eyes, still glued to the floor. Heat crept up my neck, my cheeks burning. I could keep up, I said, my voice smaller than I wanted, trembling at the edges. "I'm not that old, Claire." She sighed, the kind of sigh you give a pet that won't stop begging. "Mom, you'd be bored. You'd need help with everything, stairs luggage, all of it. It's better if you stay home. We'll send pictures." Pictures. As if a snapshot could capture the sound of my grandchildren's laughter, the warmth of sand beneath my feet, the chance to be woven into their memories. I wanted to argue, to tell her I'd hiked trails with Tom in our 50s, my boots crunching through snow in the Rockies, that I still walked 2 miles every morning, rain or shine, that I wasn't some delicate antique to be tucked away on a shelf. But the words lodged in my throat, heavy and useless. Greg's smirk. Claire's impatience. Michael's silence, they pressed against me, a weight I couldn't shake. I nodded, muttered something about understanding, and turned to the sink, scrubbing a plate that was already spotless, my hands trembling in the soapy water. That night I sank into Tom's armchair, the leather worn soft by years of his presence. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. I thought about the years I'd poured into them, Claire and Michael, the pieces of my heart walking around in the world. I'd been their driver, ferrying them to soccer practice and piano lessons, their cook stirring pots of chili on snowy nights, their comforter wiping tears after first heartbreaks. When Tom got sick, I became his caretaker too, measuring out pills, changing bandages, holding his hand as the cancer stole him away. I'd promised him I'd keep our family together, that I'd be their anchor, and I had. Even after he was gone, I kept the traditions alive: Christmas dinners with his favorite pecan pie birthday calls, with silly songs loans when Claire's boutique struggled, or Michael's roof sprang a leak. I thought that's what mothers did. I thought it mattered. But Claire's words circled in my mind, relentless as a storm. Too old. Slow us down. I looked at the photo on the mantel, me and Tom, 30 years ago, laughing on a rocky beach in Maine. My hair was chestnut, then my smile unguarded. Was that woman gone? Had I let her fade piece by piece until I was just Mom, a footnote in their story? My fingers brushed the frame, the glass cool against my skin. I wasn't angry yet. That would come later, a slow burn building in my chest. That night, I was just wounded, the kind of hurt that settles deep, that makes you question if you've ever been truly seen. I didn't sleep much. The ache in my chest kept me awake, my thoughts tangling like threads. I remembered Claire as a little girl, her tiny hand in mine as we picked daisies in the backyard. I remembered Michael, his face lit up when Tom taught him to ride a bike, my cheers echoing down the street. Where had those children gone? When had they decided I was no longer part of their world? The questions gnawed at me, each one a fresh sting. I thought of Tom, how he'd always known what to say, how his steady voice could calm any storm. "You're stronger than you know, Maggie." He'd told me once, his hand warm on mine. I wanted to believe him, but that night I felt small, brittle, like a leaf ready to crumble. The next morning I rose early, as I always do, the habit of decades unbroken. The sky was heavy gray clouds, promising rain. I made coffee, the familiar ritual grounding me, and sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around the warm mug. On the table lay the brochure Claire had left behind its glossy cover, taunting me with images of palm trees and smiling families. I hadn't meant to touch it, but my fingers moved on their own, flipping it open to a page about the resort villas with ocean views, dining under starlit skies. The words swam as my eyes filled, not with tears for the trip, but for the woman I used to be, the one who believed family was a circle that held you close, who thought love could keep you from being cast aside. I sat there for a long time, the coffee growing cold, the brochure open before me. I thought about Claire's laugh, Greg's smirk, Michael's silence. I thought about the years I'd given the pieces of myself I'd carved away to make their lives brighter. And I thought about Tom, his voice echoing in my mind, telling me I was strong. I didn't know it then, but that brochure was the beginning. It was the moment I stopped letting their words define me. It was the moment I began to fight, not with shouts or tears, but with something quieter, something fiercer, my own worth, waiting to be reclaimed. The rain came that morning, a soft patter against the windows, as if the sky itself were weeping for me. I sat at the kitchen table, the brochure still open, its vibrant colors, mocking the grayness of my mood. Claire's words echoed in my mind, too old. Slow us down, each syllable, a bruise that pulsed with every heartbeat. I wanted to call her, to demand an explanation, to ask when I'd become a burden instead of a mother. But my phone stayed untouched on the counter, its silence louder than any argument. I was Margaret, the woman who'd always fix things, who'd stitch together broken toys and broken hearts. Yet here I was, unable to mend the fracture in my own family. The house felt emptier than it ever had. For years I'd filled it with noise, Claire's piano practice, Michael's laughter, Tom's humming as he tinkered in the garage. Even after Tom was gone, I'd kept it alive with my own small rituals. The radio playing old jazz, the kettle whistling, the clatter of my knitting needles. But now the silence was a weight pressing against my chest. I wandered from room to room, touching things, a quilt I'd made for Claire's wedding, a model plane Michael built at 12, Tom's favorite mug chipped, but still in the cupboard. Each object was a memory, a piece of a life I thought would hold forever. Had I been wrong all along? Had I poured myself into a family that no longer saw me? By noon, the rain had thickened, drumming against the roof. I couldn't stay inside, not with the walls closing in each corner, whispering my loneliness. I pulled on my raincoat, the green one Tom bought me years ago, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the street slick and shining. I walked my usual route 2 miles along the quiet roads of our small town, past the bakery where I used to buy Claire's favorite cinnamon rolls, past the park where Michael learned to swing. My shoes squelched in the puddles, but I didn't care. The rain hid the tears I hadn't realized were falling. I don't know what made me stop at the library. Maybe it was the warmth of the lights spilling onto the wet pavement, or maybe it was just habit. Tom and I used to spend hours there. Him with his history books, me with novels that carried me to other worlds. Inside, the familiar smell of paper and polish wrapped around me like a shawl. I nodded to the librarian, Mrs. Carter, who'd known me since Claire was in pigtails. "Margaret, you're soaked," she said, her voice kind but not prying. I managed a smile, murmuring something about needing a book to pass the time. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just a reason to be somewhere that wasn't my house. I drifted to the travel section, my fingers brushing the spines of guidebooks, Paris, Tuscany, the Caribbean. I pulled one out, a thick volume on the Bahamas, its cover showing the same turquoise water as Claire's brochure. I sank into a chair, the book heavy in my lap, and flipped through it, not reading, just looking. The pictures were beautiful, but they hurt each one, a reminder of the trip I wasn't allowed to join. I closed the book, my hands trembling, and pressed my palms to my eyes, willing the ache to ease. Margaret. The voice was soft, familiar, pulling me back. I looked up to see Ruth, my oldest friend, standing there, her silver hair tucked under a scarf, a stack of mysteries under her arm. Ruth and I had known each other since high school, back when we were girls with big dreams and bigger laughs. She'd been at my wedding, held my hand at Tom's funeral, brought soup when I caught the flu last winter. But we drifted lately, life pulling us in different directions. Seeing her now felt like finding a lost earring, unexpected and precious. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, sitting across from me, her eyes searching mine. I tried to laugh, but it came out as a choke. "Just a rough day," I said, waving a hand as if I could brush it away. Ruth didn't push, but she didn't leave either. She set her books down, leaned forward, and waited the way only old friends can. Something in me cracked, then a dam giving way. I told her everything. Claire's words, Greg's smirk, Michael's silence, the vacation I wasn't welcome on. The story spilled out raw and jagged, my voice low to keep from breaking. I told her how small I felt, how I wondered if I'd ever been more than a convenience to my children, a prop in their lives, until they no longer needed me. Ruth listened, her face soft but her eyes sharp the way they got when she was angry. When I finished, she reached across the table, her hand warm on mine. "Margaret, you're not invisible," she said, her voice firm. "You've spent your whole life giving, but that doesn't mean you're empty. You're still here, and you're still you." Her words were simple, but they landed like a lifeline, pulling me from the dark water I'd been sinking into. I wanted to believe her, but the hurt was still too fresh a wound that hadn't scabbed over. We talked for a while, the library quiet around us. Ruth told me about her own struggles, her son, who rarely called, her arthritis, which made gardening harder but didn't stop her. She spoke of a trip she'd taken last year alone to a little cabin in the mountains. "I thought I'd be lonely," she said, "but I wasn't. I found pieces of myself I'd forgotten. She squeezed my hand. You don't need their permission to live, Margaret. You never did. I left the library with a borrowed book I didn't plan to read, and something else, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in days. Not anger, not yet, but a stirring, like the first green shoot after a long winter. Ruth's words stayed with me as I walked home, the rain lighter, now the air fresher. I thought about the woman I'd been with Tom, the one who'd danced in the kitchen, who'd planned adventures, who'd laughed until her sides ached. Was she still there, buried under years of duty and loss? I didn't know, but for the first time I wanted to find out. Back home I hung my coat, the house still quiet but less oppressive. I made tea, the ritual calming, and sat at the table, the brochure catching my eye again. This time I didn't flinch. I opened it, tracing the pictures with my finger, villas, beaches, a woman my age, smiling by the water. I thought about Ruth, about her trip, about her words. You don't need their permission to live. I thought about Claire, so quick to dismiss me and Greg with his smug grin. I thought about Michael, who couldn't even meet my eyes. And I thought about me, Margaret, who'd given everything and been left with nothing but a brochure and a broken heart. I didn't decide anything that day, not really, but I kept the brochure out, not hidden in a drawer, but there on the table, a quiet defiance. I called Ruth later just to hear her voice, and we made plans to meet for coffee. It was a small thing, but it felt like a step, like testing the ground after a fall. That night, I slept better, not deeply, but without the weight of tears. I dreamed of the ocean, not the one in Claire's pictures, but the one Tom and I had seen in Maine, wild and endless, its waves whispering secrets only I could hear. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. I looked at the brochure again, but this time I saw something new, a phone number, small print at the bottom for reservations. I didn't pick up the phone, not yet, but I wrote the number down, my handwriting steady, and tucked it into my pocket. It was a tiny act, barely noticeable, but it felt like mine. For the first time in days, I felt like Margaret again, not the mother they'd discarded, but the woman who still had a story to write. The days that followed were a blur of quiet rebellion, each one a step away from the woman who'd stood silent in her kitchen, swallowing her daughter's dismissal. I woke each morning to the same gray sky, the rain lingering like an unwelcome guest. But the ache in my chest was shifting. It wasn't gone. Claire's words, too old, slow us down, still stung, sharp as a splinter, but it was joined by something else, something stubborn and alive. I wasn't ready to name it, not yet, but it pushed me forward like a current beneath still water. I kept the resort's phone number in my pocket, folded into a square of paper I touched now and then, as if it were a talisman. I didn't call, but its presence was enough a reminder that I could choose something for myself, even if I wasn't sure what. The brochure stayed on the kitchen table, no longer a taunt, but a challenge. I'd catch myself staring at it over my coffee, imagining the ocean, the sand, the life I'd been told I couldn't have. I began to wonder what it would feel like to go there, not with Claire or her family, but alone on my terms. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff. The house, once a suffocating cage, started to feel different. I moved through it with purpose, dusting shelves I'd neglected, sorting drawers cluttered with old receipts and birthday cards. I found a photo album from years ago, Tom and me in our 40s, Claire and Michael still small, all of us grinning at a county fair cotton candy staining their cheeks. I sat on the couch, the album heavy in my lap, and traced their faces with my finger. I didn't cry, though the urge was there. Instead, I felt a quiet anger, not the burning kind, but something colder, steadier. When had my children decided I was no longer part of their story, and why had I let them? I met Ruth for coffee that week as we'd planned. The cafe was a cozy place downtown, its walls lined with mismatched art, the air thick with the scent of espresso. Ruth was already there, her scarf draped over the chair, her smile warm as she waved me over. We talked about small things at first, her garden, my knitting, the new librarian who was too strict about overdue fines. But Ruth had a way of seeing through my careful words, her eyes catching the shadows I tried to hide. "You're still thinking about that trip, aren't you?" she said, stirring her latte, her voice gentle but direct. I nodded, my fingers tightening around my mug. "I can't stop. It's not just the trip, Ruth. It's everything." The way Claire looked at me like I was nothing. The way Michael didn't say a word. I've given them everything, and now I'm just left over. My voice cracked, and I looked away, embarrassed by the rawness of it. Ruth reached across the table, her hand steady on mine. "You're not left over, Margaret. You're a woman who's loved fiercely, and that's not a small thing. But love doesn't mean you owe them your whole self. You get to keep some of that for you." Her words landed softly like snow, and I felt them settle into me. We sat there for hours, the cafe humming around us, and I told her things I hadn't said aloud before, how I'd stopped dreaming for myself after Tom died, how I'd poured every hope into Claire and Michael, how I'd let their needs become my purpose. Ruth listened, nodding, her face a mirror of my pain and my strength. She told me about her own rediscovery after her husband passed, how she'd learned to paint at 60, how she'd traveled to places she'd only read about. "It's not about proving them wrong," she said. "It's about proving yourself right." I left the cafe with a warmth I hadn't felt in weeks, Ruth's words echoing in my mind. On the walk home, I passed the travel agency on Main Street, its window plastered with posters of faraway places: Venice, Bali, the Bahamas. I slowed my reflection faint in the glass, and for a moment I saw the woman I used to be, the one who'd planned road trips with Tom, who'd laughed at the rain. I didn't go inside, but I stood there longer than I meant to the idea of a journey, any journey taking root. That evening I did something small but bold. I called the resort. My hands shook as I dialed the paper with the number creased from my pocket. The woman on the other end was kind, her voice smooth, as she described the villas, the dining, the spa. I didn't book anything, just asked questions, letting the possibility feel real. "We'd love to have you," she said, and I almost laughed at how simple it sounded, as if I could just decide to belong somewhere new. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there, my heart racing. It was a tiny act, but it felt like defiance, like saying I'm still here. The next day, I went through my closet, something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out dresses I'd forgotten, bright florals, soft linens, things I'd worn when Tom was alive, when I felt seen. I tried one on a blue sundress that still fit and stood in front of the mirror. My hair was gray now, my face lined, but my eyes were the same, sharp and alive. I smiled at myself, tentative at first, then stronger. I didn't look like a burden. I looked like Margaret. I started walking farther each morning, pushing past my usual 2 miles to 3, then 4. The rain had stopped, the air crisp with the first hints of spring. I noticed things I'd missed before: daffodils pushing through the soil, the way the light caught the river near the park. I waved to neighbors, stopped to chat with Mr. Evans, who was pruning his roses. "You look brighter, Margaret," he said, and I realized he was right. The weight was still there, but I was carrying it differently. My shoulders straighter, my steps surer. One afternoon I found myself at the bank, not planning to, but drawn there by a memory. Years ago, Tom and I had set up a savings account, a nest egg we'd meant to use for travel, for the adventures we'd planned but never took. After he died, I'd left it untouched, too raw to think of spending it without him. But now I asked the teller to check the balance. She printed a slip, and when I saw the number, my breath caught. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than I'd remembered, enough for a trip, maybe more. I folded the slip and tucked it into my purse, my heart pounding. It wasn't about the money. It was about the choice, the power to decide what came next. That night, I wrote a letter to Tom. I hadn't done that since the first year after his death, when I'd pour my grief onto pages I never sent. This time, it was different. I told him about Claire, about the hurt, about Ruth and the bank and the phone call to the resort. I told him I was scared, but trying, that I wanted to be the woman he'd loved, the one he'd called strong. I sealed the letter and tucked it into the drawer with the others, a ritual that felt like a promise to myself. I saw Ruth again that week, and we laughed more this time, our conversation lighter. She showed me pictures from her mountain trip, her face glowing in the sunlight. "You should go somewhere, Margaret," she said. "Not to escape, but to remember who you are." I didn't tell her about the bank account or the letter, but I told her about the sundress, and she clapped her hands, delighted. "That's my girl," she said, and I felt it. My girl, not Claire's mom, not Michael's burden, but me, Margaret, coming back to life. The brochure was still on the table, its pages worn from my touch. I didn't call the resort again, but I kept the number close, and I started a list, just a few words on a scrap of paper. Beach, sundress, ocean. It was small, but it was mine, a map to a place I was beginning to imagine. I wasn't ready to book the trip, not yet, but I was ready to believe I could. And that, for now, was enough. The spring air turned warmer, the days stretching longer, and I felt myself unfolding like a flower after a frost. The hurt from Claire's words hadn't vanished, too old. "Slow us down" still echoed in quiet moments, but it was no longer the loudest thing in my heart. Something else was growing, a quiet strength that came not from anger, but from a rediscovery of who I was, who I'd always been beneath the roles of mother, wife, caregiver. I was Margaret, and I was beginning to see her again, not as a shadow in my children's lives, but as a woman with her own light. I kept walking my morning routes, now stretching to 5 miles, my legs stronger, my breath steadier. The town felt new again, its familiar streets revealing details I'd overlooked for years, the way the bakery's awning glowed red at dawn, the chatter of sparrows in the oak by the library. I started carrying a small notebook, jotting down things that caught my eye, a child's lost mitten on a fence, the smell of fresh bread, the curve of a cloud. It was a habit I'd had in my 20s when Tom and I were young and the world felt wide. Writing again felt like reclaiming a piece of that girl, the one who dreamed of painting and poetry before life turned practical. The brochure remained on my kitchen table, its edges curling from my touch. I hadn't called the resort again, but I'd started researching my old laptop, humming, as I clicked through websites about the Bahamas, its history, its beaches, its culture. I learned about the Junkanoo Festival, the vibrant parades Tom would have loved, and I imagined myself there not as Claire's mother, but as Margaret, a woman tasting the world. The savings account balance tucked in my purse was a quiet promise. I didn't need to decide yet, but knowing I could was a power I hadn't felt in years. One morning, I stopped by the travel agency I'd passed weeks before. The posters in the window were the same: Venice, Bali, the Bahamas, but this time I went inside. The agent, a young woman named Lisa with a bright smile, greeted me like I was expected. "Planning a trip?" she asked, and I hesitated, my fingers tightening on my purse. "Just looking," I said, but she didn't push, just handed me a stack of pamphlets and asked what I loved about travel. I surprised myself by talking about the trips Tom and I took, the mountains we'd hiked, the way the sea looked at dusk. Lisa listened, her eyes kind, and when I left, I had a pamphlet on solo travel, its cover showing a woman my age laughing by a palm tree. I tucked it into my bag, my heart lighter than when I'd walked in. At home, I started making changes, small but deliberate. I rearranged the living room, moving Tom's armchair to face the window where I could see the garden. I bought new curtains, soft yellow ones that caught the light, and hung them myself, standing on a stepladder with a screwdriver, my hands steady. I planted lavender in the backyard, its scent a memory of the perfume Tom loved. Each act felt like a stitch, mending the parts of me that had frayed. I wasn't erasing the hurt, Claire's dismissal, Michael's silence, Greg's smirk, but I was building something new around it, a life that was mine. Ruth noticed the change. We met again, this time at her house, where she served tea in mismatched cups and showed me her latest painting, a vivid swirl of blues and greens. "You're different, Margaret," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You're standing taller." I laughed, brushing it off, but I knew she was right. I told her about the travel agency, the lavender, the notebook. She clapped her hands delighted and pulled out a photo album from her solo trip to the mountains. "This is what I mean," she said, pointing to a picture of herself by a lake, her face serene. "You find yourself when you stop waiting for them to find you." Her words stayed with me, and I began to act on them. I signed up for a painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. The first session was awkward, my hands clumsy with the brush, the canvas, a mess of colors, but I loved it the way the paint felt alive, the way I could create something just for me. The instructor, a woman in her 70s with a wild laugh, told me to stop thinking and just feel. I did. And for those 2 hours, I wasn't Claire's mother or Michael's burden. I was Margaret making art, making mistakes, making joy. I also went through my finances, something I'd avoided since Tom's death. I'd always let him handle the big decisions, but now I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of papers. The savings account was only part of it. There was a small investment Tom had made years ago, a stock he'd bought on a whim, now worth more than I'd expected. There was also the house paid off long ago, its value higher than I'd realized. I wasn't rich, but I had options, choices I'd never considered. I made an appointment with a financial advisor a woman Ruth recommended and walked out with a plan not to spend it all but to use it wisely to build a future I wanted. One evening I found a box in the attic, one I hadn't opened since Tom died. Inside were letters we'd written to each other during his first year in the Army before we married. I sat on the floor, dust on my knees, and read them his words, looping across the page in his careful script. "Maggie, you're my home no matter where I am." I cried then, not for the loss, but for the love we'd had, the kind that still held me up. I found his old watch in the box, its leather strap worn, but the face still ticking. I put it on the weight familiar and wore it every day after a reminder of the woman he'd seen, the one I was finding again. I started cooking for myself, not just reheating leftovers, but real meals, roast chicken with herbs, pasta with fresh tomatoes, desserts I hadn't made in years. I set the table with my good china, lit a candle, played Ella Fitzgerald on the radio. It felt silly at first, dining alone with such care, but it became a ritual, a way of honoring myself. I invited Ruth over one night, and we laughed over wine and lemon tart, the house alive with our voices. "This is you, Margaret," she said, raising her glass. "This is what they can't take." I thought about Claire and Michael often, the pain still sharp but less consuming. I hadn't heard from them since that day in the kitchen, though I'd seen Claire's posts online, pictures of her kids, her life moving forward without me. I didn't call, didn't text. I wanted to, but something stopped me, a need to protect this new, fragile version of myself. I wondered if they noticed my silence, if they cared. Part of me hoped they did, but another part, the stronger part, didn't need their validation anymore. One afternoon I drove to the cemetery, something I hadn't done in months. Tom's grave was under an oak, the grass soft with new growth. I sat there, the watch ticking on my wrist, and told him everything: the painting class, the lavender, the savings account, the woman I was becoming. I told him I was scared but excited, that I missed him, but felt him with me. I left a sprig of lavender on his stone, its scent lingering as I walked away, my steps lighter than when I'd arrived. Back home, I opened the brochure again, this time with purpose. I called the resort, my voice steady, as I asked about availability prices, solo packages. The woman on the phone was the same one I'd spoken to before, and she remembered me. "You sound ready," she said, and I smiled, realizing she was right. I didn't book the trip, not yet, but I reserved a spot, a placeholder for the woman I was becoming. I wrote more in my notebook that night: ocean sundress freedom, the words a map to a place I could almost see. I wasn't there yet, but I was moving each step, a quiet claim to my own life. The hurt was still there, but it was no longer my cage. I was Margaret, and I was writing my own story, one choice at a time. The weeks slipped by, each one layering new strength over the wounds I'd carried since that day in the kitchen. Claire's words, "too old, slow us down," still lingered, but they were softer now, like a bruise fading under the skin. I was learning to live with them, not by forgetting, but by building something louder, something mine. The woman I'd been with Tom, the one who'd laughed and dreamed, was coming back, not in a rush, but in quiet moments, in choices I made for myself. I was Margaret, and I was no longer waiting for my children to see me. My mornings began with purpose. I'd wake before dawn, the house still dark, and make coffee, the ritual grounding me. I'd sit by the window, the yellow curtains catching the first light, and write in my notebook fragments of thoughts, sketches of the ocean I hadn't yet seen, lists of things I wanted to try: a dance class, a trip to a museum, a recipe for mango sorbet. The notebook was filling up its pages, a testament to a life I was claiming one word at a time. I'd walk afterward my route now, a steady 6 miles, my body stronger than it had been in years. I'd nod to neighbors, stop to pet a dog, or pause by the river watching the water catch the sun. These were small things, but they felt like victories, proof that I was more than the mother Claire had dismissed. The painting class became my sanctuary. Every Tuesday, I'd walk to the community center, my sketchbook under my arm, and lose myself in color and light. My hands were still clumsy, my canvases more passion than precision, but I loved the mess of it, the way the paint smeared the way mistakes could become something new. The instructor, Clara, would lean over my shoulder, her wild laugh filling the room. "Feel it, Margaret," she'd say. "Don't think, just feel." And I did. For those hours, I wasn't defined by my children's indifference or my widow's grief. I was a creator, a woman with stories to tell in blues and golds. One day, I painted a wave, its crest curling like a promise, and Clara clapped, calling it bold. I took the canvas home, hung it in the living room, and smiled every time I passed it. Ruth was my constant, her friendship, a steady flame. We'd meet often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for walks through her garden, where she'd point out her roses, their petals soft as silk. She'd ask about my plans, her eyes bright with mischief, and I'd tell her about the resort, the savings account, the solo travel pamphlet I kept on my nightstand. "You're going to do it, aren't you?" she said one afternoon, her voice half question, half certainty. I didn't answer, not directly, but I felt the truth of it in my bones. The idea of the trip was no longer a fantasy. It was a possibility, one I was shaping with every step I took. I began to take bigger steps, ones that scared me. I met with the financial advisor again this time to discuss not just the savings account, but the house, the investments, the life I wanted to build. She was practical, but kind. Her questions pushing me to think beyond survival. "What do you want, Margaret?" she asked, and I realized I hadn't been asked that in years. I told her I wanted freedom, security, a chance to see the world. She nodded, scribbling notes, and when I left, I had a plan not just for the trip, but for the years ahead. The house was an asset, she said, one I could leverage if I chose. The idea of selling it, of leaving the place where I'd raised my family, was daunting, but it was also a power I hadn't known I held. I started sorting through the house with new eyes, not as a museum of memories, but as a space I could shape. I packed away things I'd kept out of habit, Claire's old toys, Michael's school trophies, dishes we'd used for holidays that no longer happened. I didn't throw them out, just boxed them, storing them in the attic with a care that felt like closure. I kept what mattered, Tom's watch, which I wore daily, the photo album from our fair days, my painting of the wave. The house felt lighter, less like a shrine to a life that had slipped away. I bought a new rug for the hallway, its colors bright, and a set of mugs with starfish patterns, a nod to the ocean I was inching toward. One evening, I found a letter from Tom tucked in a book I'd pulled from the shelf. It was from our early years, written when he was away on a work trip. "Maggie, you make every day brighter," he'd written. "Don't ever forget how strong you are." I read it by lamplight, my fingers tracing his words, and felt him with me not as a ghost, but as a warmth urging me forward. I wore his watch to bed that night, its soft ticking a lullaby, and dreamed of a beach, the sand warm under my feet, my sundress catching the breeze. I began to reach out not to Claire or Michael, but to others I'd let drift away. I called my cousin Ellen, who lived an hour away, and we talked for hours laughing about our childhood summers. I joined a book club at the library where I met women my age, their stories of loss and resilience echoing my own. One woman, Diane, invited me to her knitting circle, and I went my needles clicking alongside theirs, our chatter filling the room. These connections, small but real, were threads in a new tapestry, one I was weaving for myself. I still thought about Claire and Michael, the silence between us, a wound that hadn't healed. I checked Claire's social media sometimes, unable to stop myself, and saw her posts about the vacation pictures of the resort's website, captions about family fun. I wondered if she'd thought of me at all, if she regretted her words. Michael hadn't called either, his silence heavier than Claire's dismissal. I wanted to reach out to bridge the gap, but I held back. This time, I needed to choose myself to protect the woman I was becoming. I wrote them letters not to send, but to release pages of hurt love and hope tucked away with Tom's letters, a weight lifted. One afternoon, I went back to the travel agency. Lisa was there, her smile as warm as before. This time, I didn't say I was just looking. I sat down the pamphlet on solo travel in my hand and told her I was thinking about the Bahamas. She pulled up details on her computer, her excitement contagious, and we talked about villas, excursions, the best times to go. I didn't book, but I left with a folder of options, my heart racing. On the way home, I stopped by the boutique on Main Street and bought a hat, a wide-brimmed straw, one perfect for a beach. I wore it in the mirror that night, laughing at myself, but also proud. It was a small thing, but it felt like a promise. I started planning not just for the trip, but for me. I enrolled in a dance class, something I'd loved as a girl, and stumbled through the steps, my body remembering what my mind had forgotten. I cooked new recipes, spicy curries and tropical desserts, imagining I was already there. I painted more my canvases bolder, one of a woman standing by the sea, her back straight, her face unseen but strong. Clara called it my best yet, and I knew she was right. Not because it was perfect, but because it was me. By the end of that month, I was different. Not whole, not yet, but closer. The brochure was now marked with notes, pages dog-eared a map to a place I was ready to claim. I wore Tom's watch, my sundress, my new hat, and carried my notebook everywhere. I was Margaret, and I was no longer invisible. The trip was still a question, but the answer was forming not in Claire's approval or Michael's call, but in the choices I made each day. I was building a life not to spite them, but to honor myself, and that was enough for now. The summer sun had settled in, warming the earth and coaxing blooms from every corner of my garden. The lavender I'd planted months ago was thriving, its purple spikes swaying in the breeze, their scent a quiet joy each time I stepped outside. I was thriving too, not in a loud, triumphant way, but in the steady-rooted way of a tree that's weathered storms. Claire's words, "too old, slow us down," were still there, a scar I could trace but no longer bled. I was Margaret, and I was building a life that belonged to me, piece by deliberate piece, each one a testament to the woman I was reclaiming. My days had a rhythm now, one I'd crafted with care. I'd wake early, the dawn light filtering through my yellow curtains, and make tea instead of coffee, a small change that felt like a gift to myself. I'd sit with my notebook writing not just observations, but dreams, places I wanted to see, things I wanted to learn, like Spanish or pottery. The notebook was nearly full, its pages a mosaic of my becoming. I'd walk after my 6-mile route now, as familiar as breathing, my body strong, my heart steady. I'd stop to talk with neighbors, their smiles warmer now, as if they could see the change in me. "You're glowing, Margaret," Mrs. Carter at the library said one morning, and I believed her not because I was vain, but because I felt it, a light I'd thought long extinguished. The painting class was my anchor, a place where I could lose myself and find myself all at once. My canvases were bolder now, full of color and movement waves, skies, figures that hinted at stories. Clara, the instructor, called me fearless, and though I laughed, I felt the truth of it. One painting, a woman in a sundress, by the ocean, her hat tilted against the wind, became my favorite. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest a mirror of the woman I was becoming. I hung it above the fireplace next to the wave I'd painted months ago, and the room felt like mine in a way it hadn't before. Ruth remained my compass, her friendship a steady guide. We'd spend evenings on her porch sipping iced tea, her roses glowing in the dusk. She'd ask about the trip, her eyes sparkling, and I'd tell her about the folder from the travel agency, now thick with notes and brochures. "You're going to book it soon," she said, not a question, but a fact. I smiled, feeling the decision solidify not as a reaction to Claire's rejection, but as a choice for myself. I showed her the straw hat I'd bought, and she insisted I wear it clapping as I modeled it, both of us laughing like girls. "That's the Margaret I know," she said, and I felt her words settle deep a truth I was finally claiming. I was taking bigger risks, ones that stretched me. I'd met with the financial advisor again this time to finalize a plan, the savings account, the investments. The house, they were tools she said to build the life I wanted. I didn't want to sell the house, not yet, but I learned I could rent it, use the income for travel, for freedom. The idea was daunting, but it was also exhilarating, a door I hadn't known was there. I started researching other destinations too. Greece, Costa Rica, places Tom and I had dreamed of but never reached. The Bahamas was still the closest to my heart, its turquoise waters, a promise I was almost ready to keep. I began to clear the house more intentionally, not just sorting, but letting go. I donated Claire's old clothes, Michael's forgotten books, keeping only what held real meaning. I found a box of Tom's things, his fishing hat, a journal he'd kept during our early years. I read it one night, his words pulling me back to the days when we'd dance in the kitchen, his arms warm around me. "Maggie, you're my adventure," he'd written, and I cried, not for loss, but for the love that still held me. I kept the journal, the hat, and gave the rest to a local charity, feeling lighter with each box I carried out. I started wearing my sundress more, the blue one I'd found in the closet, and bought another, a soft coral that made me feel alive. I wore Tom's watch, its ticking a steady reminder of my strength, and the straw hat which drew compliments from strangers. I was becoming visible not just to others, but to myself. I joined a dance class, my body awkward at first, but learning the music, pulling me into steps I hadn't tried since I was young. I laughed when I stumbled, and the other women laughed with me, their encouragement a new kind of family. I reached out further, rebuilding connections I'd let fade. I visited my cousin Ellen, spending a weekend at her house, where we cooked together, her kitchen, filled with the smell of bread and stories. I called old friends, some I hadn't spoken to in years, and found them eager to reconnect. The book club grew into a circle of confidants, women who shared their own hurts and triumphs, their voices a chorus that lifted me. I hosted a knitting night at my house, the living room alive with chatter and needles, the starfish mugs filled with tea. These were my people, not by blood, but by choice, and they saw me, Margaret, not just a mother or widow, but a woman with a story still unfolding. I thought about Claire and Michael less, though the ache was still there, a quiet pulse. I hadn't heard from them, and I stopped checking Claire's posts, the act a small but powerful release. I wrote them another letter unsent, pouring out the hurt, the love, the woman I was becoming. It joined the others in the drawer, a ritual of letting go. I didn't need their approval, not anymore, but I hoped in some corner of my heart that they'd see me one day, not as the mother they'd dismissed, but as the woman I was now. One morning, I drove to the coast, a spontaneous trip to a beach an hour away. I wore my sundress, my hat, and walked barefoot in the sand, the waves cold against my toes. I stood there, the wind tugging at my hair, and felt the ocean's vastness, its indifference a kind of freedom. I wasn't at the resort, not yet, but I was close, the dream no longer distant. I collected a shell, smooth and white, and kept it in my pocket, a talisman alongside the resort's number. That evening I called the resort again, my voice calm, certain. I spoke to the same woman who remembered me, her warmth like an old friend's. I didn't just ask questions this time. I booked a villa, a small one, for a week in the fall. I used the savings account, the money Tom and I had saved for adventures, and felt him smiling as I did. "You're all set," Margaret, the woman, said, and I thanked her, my heart full. I hung up and sat there, the brochure open, my notebook beside it. I wrote one word, yes, and felt it echo through me, a vow to myself. I painted that night a canvas of the ocean. I'd seen its waves, wild and free. It was my best yet, not because it was flawless, but because it was true. I hung it in my bedroom, a reminder of the woman who'd said yes. I wore Tom's watch, my sundress, my hat, and danced in the living room, the radio playing jazz. My steps light. I was Margaret, and I was ready, not just for the trip, but for the life I was building. One choice, one wave, one yes at a time. The air had turned crisp by the time I finalized my plans, the first whispers of fall rustling through the trees. My villa was booked, the date set for a week in October, and the reality of it settled into me like a warm ember. I could see it so clearly, the ocean stretching endless before me, the sand soft under my feet, the woman I'd become standing tall in her sundress, her straw hat tilted against the sun. Claire's words, "too old, slow us down," were now just a faint echo drowned out by the life I'd built, the choices I'd made. I was Margaret, and I was no longer invisible, not to myself, not to the world I was stepping into. But the story wasn't finished. The hurt Claire and her family had caused hadn't vanished. It had simply transformed, fueling the strength I'd found. I'd thought my trip would be the end of it, a quiet triumph for me alone. I hadn't planned for what came next, hadn't expected the opportunity to shift the balance, to let my dignity speak louder than their dismissal. It began with a phone call, one that changed everything. It was late September, the lavender in my garden fading but still fragrant. I was in the kitchen sipping tea, my notebook open to a page of plans, excursions for the trip, a new painting idea, a recipe for conch fritters I wanted to try. The phone rang, the landline I rarely used, and I answered, expecting Ruth or Ellen. Instead, it was Claire, her voice tight, almost panicked. "Mom, we've got a problem," she said, no greeting, no warmth. "The resort canceled our booking. They said it's fully reserved and our deposit's gone. Greg's furious, and we don't know what to do." I stood there, the receiver cool against my ear, my heart steady but my mind racing. I'd heard from Claire only once since that day in the kitchen, a brief text about Lily's school play, nothing more. Now she was calling not to apologize, not to reconnect, but to demand help as if I were a switchboard for their crises. "What happened?" I asked, my voice calm, though I felt a spark of something, curiosity maybe, or the edge of an idea. She explained, her words tumbling over each other. The resort had emailed them that morning saying their reservation for the same week in October was voided due to a private booking. Their deposit, non-refundable, was lost, and their savings poured into the trip were gone. "It's a disaster," she said. "We've been planning this for months. Can you talk to them? You're good with people. Maybe they'll listen to you." I heard Greg in the background, his voice sharp, and the sound of my grandchildren oblivious to the chaos. I waited, letting her words hang, my silence a choice. "Claire," I said finally, "why do you think I can fix this?" She hesitated, then sighed, the same impatient sigh from that day in the kitchen. "Mom, you always figure things out. Please just try." There was no apology. No acknowledgement of the hurt she'd caused, just the assumption that I'd step in as I always had. I looked at the brochure on the table, my reservation confirmation tucked inside, and felt a clarity I hadn't expected. "I'll see what I can do," I said, and hung up my hands, steady my mind already turning. I didn't call the resort right away. Instead, I sat with my tea, the house quiet around me, and thought about Claire, Greg, Michael, the family I'd poured my life into. I thought about the years I'd given money for Claire's business repairs, for Michael's house, the endless ways I'd tried to keep them close. I thought about their laughter, their dismissal, the way they'd made me feel small. And I thought about the woman I was now, the one who'd booked a villa, who'd painted waves, who danced in her living room. That woman didn't owe them a rescue. That woman had her own power. The next day, I called the resort not to plead Claire's case, but to ask a question. The woman I'd spoken to before Sarah answered, her voice as kind as ever. "Margaret, everything's set for your stay," she said, assuming I was checking in. I thanked her, then asked casually about the resort's booking policies, about what it would take to reserve the entire property. She explained that it was possible, though expensive, and that a private booking had indeed been made for the week Claire's family had planned to go. "It's a special event," she said, "but I can't share details." I nodded, though she couldn't see me, and thanked her again, a plan forming sharp and clear. I called my financial advisor that afternoon. We'd already discussed the house, the investments, the savings, but now I had a specific goal. I asked about liquidating a portion of the stock Tom had bought years ago, enough to cover something bold. She was cautious but supportive, running numbers, while I explained vaguely that I wanted to make a statement to honor myself and Tom. By the end of the call, I had a figure, a sum that made my heart race, but also felt right. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but I knew what I was going to do. The next morning, I called Sarah at the resort again. This time, I wasn't asking questions. I told her I wanted to book the entire property for the week I'd already reserved, to make it a private event just for me. She paused, surprised, then asked if I was sure, explaining the cost, the logistics. I was sure. I gave her the details, arranged the payment, and asked her to keep it confidential, to list it as an anonymous booking. "This is for me," I said, and she understood, her voice warm with something like pride. "We'll make it special, Margaret," she promised. I didn't stop there. I called a lawyer, one Ruth had recommended for estate planning. I'd been thinking about my will, about the house, about what I wanted to leave behind. I told him I wanted to set up a trust, not for Claire or Michael, but for a cause Tom had loved, a scholarship fund for local kids, the kind he'd always wished we could support. I redirected the money I'd planned to leave them, not out of spite, but because I wanted my legacy to mean something, to reflect the woman I was now. The lawyer was efficient, his questions sharp, and by the end of the week, the trust was in motion, the paperwork signed. When Claire called again, her voice edged with frustration, I was ready. "Did you talk to them?" she asked. No hello, no softness. I told her I had, that the resort was booked for a private event, that there was nothing I could do. She groaned, blaming the resort. Greg the world, but not herself, not her words. I listened, my heart calm, and when she asked if I could lend her money to book somewhere else, I said simply, "No." She was silent, stunned, and I ended the call. My hands steady, my breath even. The revelation came a week later, not through me, but through the resort. Sarah, true to her word, had kept my booking anonymous, but Claire's persistence led her to dig. She called me one evening, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Mom, did you book the resort?" "The whole thing. They said it's a private event, and I heard it's you." I didn't deny it. "Yes," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I did." She stammered, asking why, how her words, a mix of anger and awe. I didn't explain, didn't justify. "It's for me," I said, and let the silence speak. Greg called next, his tone sharp, accusing me of sabotage, of stealing their trip. I listened, my dignity a shield, and told him the truth. I'd booked the resort for myself, because I deserved it, because I was more than the burden they'd made me feel. Michael called last, his voice soft, uncertain, asking if it was true. "It is," I said, and he didn't argue, just hung up his silence, a weight I no longer carried. They didn't come to the house, didn't confront me in person, but I knew they were reeling, their plans, shattered, their savings gone, their assumptions about me upended. I didn't shout, didn't gloat. My power was in my quiet, in the life I'd built, in the choice I'd made to honor myself. I was Margaret, and I was enough. The October sky was a brilliant blue when I arrived at the resort, the ocean stretching before me like a promise kept. I stepped out of the shuttle, my straw hat shading my eyes, my sundress catching the breeze, and felt the weight of the past months lift, not gone, but lighter, like a stone smoothed by the tide. The air was warm, scented with salt and frangipani, and the sound of the waves was a song I'd dreamed of for so long. I was Margaret, 67 years old, standing on a beach I'd chosen for myself, and for the first time in years, I felt whole, not because I'd won, not because I'd proven them wrong, but because I'd proven myself right. The villa was everything I'd imagined: white walls, open windows, a balcony where I could sit with my tea and watch the sunrise. The resort staff greeted me like an old friend Sarah from the phone calls there to welcome me, her smile warm as she handed me the key. "This is your week, Margaret," she said, and I believed her. The property was mine, not in a boastful way, but in a quiet, sacred one, a space I'd claimed not to exclude others, but to include myself. I walked the grounds alone, my sandals soft on the paths touching the palm trees, breathing in the freedom I'd fought for. I didn't hear from Claire or Michael after that last call, and I didn't expect to. Their silence was their choice, just as my trip was mine. I thought of them often, not with anger, but with a kind of peace. I'd loved them fiercely, given them everything, and part of me always would. But I'd learned that love doesn't mean erasing yourself, that family isn't a debt you owe forever. I'd redirected their inheritance to the scholarship fund, the paperwork finalized before I left, and it felt right, a legacy for Tom, for the kids he'd wanted to help, for the woman I was now. I didn't need their forgiveness, and I didn't seek their regret. I had my own grace, and it was enough. Each day at the resort was a gift. I woke early, walking the beach at dawn, the sand cool under my feet, the waves whispering secrets. I collected shells, small treasures I'd keep in a jar, and sketched them in my notebook. The page is now a tapestry of this new chapter. I joined a cooking class, learning to make conch fritters, laughing with the chef when I spilled flour. I took a boat tour, the wind in my hair, dolphins leaping beside us, and felt Tom with me, his smile in the sunlight. I danced one evening, a local band playing under the stars, my steps clumsy but joyful, strangers clapping as I spun. I was Margaret, and I was alive. I painted too, setting up an easel on my balcony, the ocean my muse. The canvas filled with blues and greens, a woman standing at the water's edge, her back to the world, her strength in her stillness. It was me, not as I'd been, but as I was now, unafraid, unbroken, whole. I left the painting in the villa when I departed, a gift to the next guest, a piece of my heart that didn't need to be carried home. Ruth called midway through the week, her voice crackling over the spotty connection. "How's my adventurer?" she asked, and I laughed, telling her about the dolphins, the fritters, the dance. "I knew you'd do it," she said, and I heard her pride, her love, the kind that asks for nothing but gives everything. I told her I'd visit when I returned, that we'd plan a trip together, maybe to her mountains or somewhere new. "You're not done yet, Margaret," she said, and I knew she was right. This was not the end, but a beginning. I thought about forgiveness sitting on the beach one evening, the stars bright above me. I didn't hate Claire, or Michael didn't wish them pain. I hoped they'd find their own peace, their own way to see what they'd lost, not just the trip, but me, the mother who'd loved them beyond measure. I didn't know if they would, and I couldn't control that. What I could control was this: my life, my choices, my heart. I forgave them, not for their sake, but for mine, to let go of the weight I no longer needed to carry. On my last day, I walked to the water's edge, the shell from the beach in my hand. I held it smooth and warm and thought of Tom, of the woman he'd loved, of the woman I'd become. I didn't need to prove anything anymore, not to Claire, not to the world, not even to myself. I was enough, had always been, and this trip, this moment, was the proof. I tossed the shell into the waves, a small gesture, a letting go and a holding on. It sank, then surfaced, carried by the tide, and I smiled, knowing I'd carry this place with me too. When I returned home, the house welcomed me not as a cage, but as a haven. The lavender was still there, the painting of the wave above the fireplace, Tom's watch on my wrist. I unpacked my suitcase, the straw hat on the shelf, the notebook filled with new pages. I called Ruth, hosted the knitting circle, joined a new art class. I was different, not because I'd changed the world, but because I'd changed my own. I was Margaret, and I was at peace. I want to tell you something, you who are listening, who might know what it's like to feel unseen, to wonder if your worth has faded with your youth. You are not your children's choices, not your family's words, not the years that mark your skin. You are the dreams you still hold, the steps you take, the life you build when no one else sees. I planted a tree in my garden yesterday, a small one, its roots just beginning. It's for me, for Tom, for the woman who said yes to herself. Plant something for you too, a tree, a hope, a moment. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself.